Hello. My name is MichaelPinsky. From the University of Pittsburgh. I'm a professor of critical care medicine, cardiovascular disease, bioengineering, and also my favorite hobby is drinking wine. What we're going to talk about now is the practical application of machine learning approaches to identify and treat critical illness. Why critical illness? Because that's what I treat. There are significant system problems that exist in healthcare. First of all, disease is not heart failure, is not hypovolemia, it's not infection. It is those things, yes, but also the host's response to it. So at all times, what you see is never the disease, but the disease plus the host interrelated with it. And therefore, by definition, no two patients can be alike. Another problem that we have, we were hearing it from the speakers this morning, is that healthcare systems are inherently complex, and by definition, they're inefficient. As we were told earlier, one of the major problems we have is that there are patient safety issues because of artifacts and just too many alerts. And that if we can prevent alarm fatigue, we would hopefully be able to get to patients sooner and forget one of the major causes of death or failure to rescue. And finally, the goals of our patients, when I sit down in the morning and the afternoon, often change. Many times we really don't even know where we're going. And these are truisms, and I'm going to address all of those. Okay? I have a modest proposal, and I think all of you agree with it. And let's make the patient the center of what's going on, and let's do true personalized medicine. And by personalized medicine, look at their own biological response and how they act. Not what they want to do, whether or not they want to be a violinist or stuff like that, but their physiologic state. Every patient has, by definition, a unique set of goals and desires, which we can then define as starting and stopping rules for resuscitation, to identify when they're unstable and when they're stable based on their own physiology. They have a unique expression of disease, and accordingly, we need to define thresholds for heart rate, respiratory rate, urine outputs, or whatever it was, and I don't care, that are unique to that patient. One size does not fit all. And they have a unique response to treatment. If I give a dose of Lasix to two patients, one of which will become hypovolemic and the other won't even pee. And we know this is true. So we have to understand the physiologic reserve of the patients. All of these things can be known. And many of these things are actually defined already. So how do we identify patterns in health and disease? Well, think of it the way you are if you hear a song on the radio. And you want to figure out what it is. And let's play Name That Tune. So what you would do is you would hear it for a moment, and you'd go into this database of all the other songs you listened to in your misspent youth, and try to figure out what it was. But let's assume that you're in a healthcare system. In a healthcare system, you don't listen to all the instruments that are being played. You have to define which instruments, which you can measure as monitoring devices, you want to use. They'll be different. And not which number of different qualities, what unique instruments. So for trumpet, I could have how much it's loud and soft and how often it is, but it's still a trumpet, right? The second thing I need to know is how long do I listen? Can I identify a song with the first note? Probably not. Maybe I need 13 minutes to listen to it if I'm really stupid. So the lead time, is it going to be 1 minute or 1 hour? How long do I want to measure for? The sampling frequency. If you're listening to a mean value of music over 1 minute, it'll just sound like bah, even though there's absolutely nothing wrong with your sensors because you're at the mean value over a minute. What you really want to know is what is the appropriate sampling frequency. So when we think about it, a lot of things we do are easy to predict. When you're falling off the cliff, you can see it ahead of time and you just close your eyes and point. Okay? Other things have dynamic changes which are quite realistic. This is the example of the number of patients that flew on airplanes from 1949 until 1990. And as you can see, it's pretty predictive what's happening. There's a variance, but you can guess what the number of people flying an airplane will do over the next few years. Importantly, this variance is health. In fact, variability is a sign of health. Our variability is our ability to adapt back and forth and to see things and be able to adjust to them. The most great variability you have is in our CNS, central nervous system, followed by our cardiovascular system, followed by our immune systems. They take energy to be present, but this variability defines health. It allows for adaptation. And more importantly, loss of normal biologic variability represents stress, and the more you lose, the closer you are to not being alive. So we looked at that in a series of studies that we did, in which we had a group of patients that were monitoring under extremely tight conditions, and they were in a step-down unit, and there was a group that crashed. And then there was another group of patients, a large number, that didn't crash, and we went backward from that time and tried to look at every single heart rate variability index we could have, with the level of variability being higher at the top. And when we looked at the patients who had crashed at the point of the square versus not crash, you can see that in fact the two groups totally and completely separated out 2 days before the event. 2 days, and never came together again. And this was sampling for only a 20-minute heart rate measurement to calculate the autocorrelation heart rate variability. And so you can, by looking at time series analysis, predict the future. But you have to be careful which variables you looked at. We looked at the exact same patients. Oh yeah, variability is good. Lack of variability. Nothing is more stable than death. You got to be careful what you look at, though, because respiratory rate was not very informative. Probably because you can breathe at whatever rate you want, you don't have the same control over heart rate. And thus, though respiratory rate may be useful for other things, in terms of identifying crash, it didn't work. Well, how do you identify how does a patient or a person identify something as being present? Well, how do babies identify faces? Well, usually they don't have a whole lot of references, and so this is usually the best you need to do to show that to a baby that this is a face. Is this correct? Probably true. However, when you get more and more data in your system, you tend to be able to recognize people better, and at some point in time you get a multivariate, multidimensional, often multi-different faction data system that allows you to distinguish extremely well between people using the exact same sampling devices you had before. All that changes is your perspective and and what information you've known before. Basically, being a wise old professor, you can have a database that is equal to that. Okay, so in the health space continuum, there are two ways that we approach this. The one is to figure out where you are right now. And to do that, you can use a static moving average of, let's say, 5 minutes, which is what we did in collaboration with Lionel Tarasenko at Oxford University in England. And he created, using an artificial neural net, on just 4 vital signs: non-invasive blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, and SpO2. We measured over this period of time what were the mean values of them, and we had a series of 150 patients. We said they're sick here, they're not sick here, they're sick here, and we allowed this machine to determine a fused parameter, which we're going to call a vital sign index. And from this, we're going to say the higher that number is, the sicker you are. With Arthur Dubronsky, who's in the audience here, we decided to take that one step further and not look at the static values over a couple of minutes, but look at the dynamic interactions. What happens when this value is going up and another is going down at the same time? Sort of like a symphony. What is the signature that defines the health or disease? And there are numerous machine learning approaches that you can use to do this, and they're listed here, and we are agnostic. We use all of them, and we allow the machine learning approaches to tell us which ones are the most effective. So let me show you some data. This is an example of one of our patients in which the nurses could not see this vital sign index, VSI, on the top, and you can see over a period of about 8 hours the heart rate, respiratory rate, SpO2, and blood pressure whenever it was measured. And the references for everything I'm showing are listed below it. As you can see, there was, by the VSI values there, that's when they call the code. But you can clearly see that this patient was unstable long before. And for the people in this 8-week period, the mean time from the first alert to a code being called was 6.3 hours. Not minutes, hours. Regrettably, when we looked at all of our data, and remember the nurses had no access to this vital sign data, but they had access to all the other vital signs, and those alarms went off just fine. Their alerts went up all the time. We had 40 VSI events that could have been a code call based on our criteria: sustained instability requiring immediate resuscitation. Only 7 were called, and when we went back and looked at every one of those, in half of them there wasn't even a note in the nurse's note saying that anything was abnormal. I was getting chest pain looking at some of these changes over a period of a half an hour, and no comments were made. And thus, we are not identifying those patients, and when we do, we can identify them earlier. But more importantly, for what I'm going to show in the next slide, I can tell you if it's an alert, if the alert is real, or if it's real important. So using this approach, we then went to the bedside and we took off the monitor and we said, okay, now we're going to show you this monitor, and when the value goes above 3.1, you absolutely positively have to come to the bedside. Oh, I'm sorry, didn't we show this? Notice these red lines here. Those are values that are every single vital sign is normal. So in the middle of this time that the person's unstable, there are periods of time when they, quote, look normal. They're not. They're a drowning person with their head over the water. They're just seeing them at that point in time. So we then went back and we said, now we're going to do a study for 8 weeks in which we're going to give you the vital sign data. And if the VSI value goes above 3, you absolutely positively have to see the patient. If you can fix it, fix it. If you can't, call a code. And then we looked at the number of times that a medical emergency response team, the machine went beep. That's all. Minimum is there was a real abnormality, but it was nothing to write home about. You just needed to fix it. And full was when you should have called a code. That was a baseline. What happened when we gave the nurses the other information? What we saw was the difference between the all and the min, which is artifact, decreased because the nurses now realized that having the information accurately present was useful. Number 2, all of our patients that went on to full started as mins. We could markedly decrease the number of patients that progressed to having a full instability. And the total amount of time that the alarms were on was cut by over 50%. The nurses said the unit was quieter and they could get their work done. What happens, though, when a patient finally does get sick? Well, if you get them early on and they're minimally unstable, I can rapidly get them better. But once a patient is really ill, I can't. So this is the basic point. I want an alert to tell me early that something's wrong, because once they have full-blown instability, it's going to take a lot of time to get better. And you know that because an asthmatic that comes in with a little bit of wheezing, give them a few hits of a bronchodilator, they're on their way. You wait 2 hours and you're giving them high-dose steroids and admitting them to the ICU. Haven't changed the asthma, I've just delayed the time in treating it. So as you heard before from the previous speaker, alarm fatigue is a very important problem. You want to know, is the alert real? Is it real important, or is it artifacts? I already showed you that with our VSI, we can tell you if it's real or if the real is very severe. But the question is it artifact? If you ever go into a television show and you're watching someone and they walk in to a unit, you know you're in an intensive care unit because you're hearing alarms going off in the background. That makes you know that you're in an ICU. All patients know that. We call it the acoustic wallpaper. People ignore them. Nurses want to know if, in fact, an alarm is real or artifact. Well, when we looked at our data, we realized that when it was an artifact, as you saw with that you saw the person scratching their arm or brushing their teeth, etc., there are certain patterns which looked very consistent and recurred with various forms of artifacts. So using machine learning approaches with Marilyn Haravnik and Artur Dobronsky, we were able to identify prospectively and then test it in a group that we could identify of the artifacts greater than 90% of the SpO2, respiratory rate, or heart rate artifacts that were real. So now when a nurse hears an alarm, she knows if she needs to go to the bedside or run. So what we have then is this principle of, in disease, let's assume that there's a threshold of stress and somebody's not getting good. So they're starting to deteriorate, as you can see here. The present time threshold for detection, let's say, is at this point, and presumably you're a good clinician and you do something and you get them back to health. I'm happy for you. What if we could now significantly decrease the threshold level that we could identify them by using these fused parameters? This would result in a significantly decreased time before we would treat the patient. And recall I showed you that if you took care of instability before it advanced too far, it took less effort. The fear of going down to this lower level, though, is that you have a higher chance of false positives. One of the problems with that, it being too sensitive, is the artifact, and I just showed you that we can reduce the artifacts. So what we have is monitoring parsimony. How do I get the minimal amount to make it work? What is the minimal number of variables, lead time, and sampling frequency? And once I know the patient's going to get in trouble, what additional information do I need? And how do I monitor when they're now back to sufficiency? So we have, I've just got 3 more slides quickly. Anomaly detection, classification, and regression. We can figure out if they're sick or not sick, why they're sick, and if they're getting better or worse. So this is an example in our animal model in which we took a pig, in this case 40 pigs, and we turned on a pump and had them bleed at 20 mLs a minute. And the time that we were able to detect the bleeding is shown on this black line, because at that point I could see the heart rate starting to go up. Bleeding started here. But as you can see, with our anomaly detector, we could cut it from 7 minutes down to 4 minutes. Another way to look at the same data is to say, how many false alerts do I have versus how soon when the bleeding starts do I get? Well, what you want to do is have 0 time, but you can't get there. If you were to look, individual vital signs, no matter how you look at them, aren't as good as taking a fuse parameter of all of them. And you could detect it in 3 minutes and 40 seconds with 1 false alert every 6 hours. To do the same things with individual vital signs, no matter how you advance them, you would get a false alert every 5 minutes. And sampling quality is shown here. Using waveform data of everything, knowing where you started, it's good. But if you then want to go to beat or every 5 minutes, you'll deteriorate. So I want to show you that that's because I knew where the data was beforehand. If I didn't know where the patient was before, and I don't have a nominal value to say he's healthy, now he's sick, and most of the times the patients come in and they're already sick, what it would look like. And I want to show you that if you didn't know where they were, the beat and the intermittent are up here. If you don't know where the patient is, you need to be in the waveform analysis to identify him. So in the future, we're going to have an ability to say a fuse parameter, how sick you are now, and a prediction of when you'll be sick, predicting instability. And as you treat the patient, the probability of the event will go down, and you'll run away from the time that it'll happen. So in the future of the monitoring, we're going to monitor the monitors, but we're going to treat the patients. We're going to use robust artifact detection, so when the machines go beep, it means something. We're going to use fuse parameters to classify disease, and we're going to scale the management based on the individual patient's needs. Thank you for your attention.